Now, this is an interesting insight from an analytic philosopher. Over on the continental side, so to speak, um, Matraverse views actually uh, echo those of Paul Ricoeur, the French narrative theorist, and hermeneut Paul Ricoeur. Matraverse's analysis of the literariness of all narrative representations is reminiscent of Paul Ricoeur's theory of the threefold mimesis, which he elaborates on in the three-volume Time and Narrative. Here, Ricoeur shows how our engagement with life itself as a narrative is what gives it human meaning. So, Ricoeur famously wrote that life is only a biological phenomenon, or human existence rather is only a biological phenomenon. It doesn't become a meaningful human life until we tell a story about it or we present it as a narrative. So stories or narratives are necessarily meaningful because to tell a story, first of all, means to select certain events and to arrange them according to a certain logic, right? Stories have a beginning, middle, and end. And in the traditional plot of stories, diba, there are certain parts we're familiar with. The climax, for example, the rising action, and then the resolution. So, in the way that we engage with stories, usually we expect the certain appropriate places where a story begins and where a story ends. And typically in a story, we look for things like conflict, who's the main protagonist there, and the point of what is the point of the story. Usually it has to do with the protagonist overcoming the conflict or not, and what kind of meaningful change had happened as a result of that adventure or change, for example. So Ricoeur's point is that when we tell stories of our lives, for example, you go on a date and you introduce yourself to somebody and you tell the story of your life, basically. You don't tell everything in a kind of robotic way, in a strictly chronological way. That would be very, very boring. So you pick out the important events, and usually your way of selecting or picking them out follows a logic, your understanding of your own character and purpose, and so forth, right? And often when we tell stories, we don't tell what happened in exactly the order that. So there are storytellers are more dramatic, for example, who would begin at the end and then go back to the beginning. It's a kind of way of explaining why things ended up that way, for example. So in other words, narrative gives meaning to human life. Without narrative, human life is just a biological phenomenon. It's the fact that we are rational creatures that tell tales about who we are, what we have, where we have been, and where we're going. That's what makes human existence meaningful in a way that the existence of animals are not in the human sense of meaning. Anyway, okay. Now, I mentioned Ricoeur because again, I think he's a much ignored philosopher, especially in the philosophy of fiction, which tends to be dominated by Anglo-American ideas from the Anglo-American analytic tradition. But I think these philosophers would benefit much from Ricoeur's notion of the threefold mimesis, his explanation of how stories have a transformative effect. So We're familiar with the word mimesis from Aristotle's analysis of the concept in his work, The Poetics. Mimesis as imitation of action. Uh, so, stories imitate life. And not just that, there's actually a two-way interaction going on. Stories stories imitate life, and life imitates stories. And Ricoeur demonstrates this through the threefold mimesis. So there's mimesis 1, which is prefiguration. Even before we read stories, we already come into them with certain expectations. So mimesis 1 or prefiguration shows that there's a connection between the lives that we actually live and the stories that we like to hear or read. So much so that before we even begin to read a story or to watch a drama series, for example, we already have certain preconceived ideas, expectations as it were. And this is why, if you're a fan of K-dramas, for example, you're already familiar with certain K-drama tropes, right? Like the May-December romance. You have the older lover and the much younger beloved. Or you have the typical story of the chaebol heir and the poor individual he or she is in love with. And then you have that amnesia plot, right? So we all know what to expect. And that's what we mean by mimesis 1 or prefiguration. Then there's mimesis 2 or configuration. This pertains to narrative emplotment, and this is what mediates between mimesis 1 and mimesis 3. So mimesis 2 pertains to the story itself, how the plot actually creates a bridge between our pre-existing conceptions about how the story should unfold and what comes after, the transformations that may occur as a result of our having read the actual story. So to understand what that means, let's consider mimesis 3. Mimesis 3 is refiguration. This pertains to understanding and transformation, or the completion of the story by the reader through the reader's application of the ideas that he got from the story in the real world. So to cite an example, the very popular Crash Landing on You K-drama, which by the way also comes to mind because I read in the news that the actors that played Captain Ri and Seri had actually gotten together in real life. So they're really now dating in real life. So I don't know if that's just media ploy, but regardless, it's a dream come true for all of these fans, shippers of Yoon Bin and Son Ye Jin. So Crash Landing on You, or Cloy, as it is popularly known, basically it's about this South Korean heiress business person who was paragliding, and then a freak storm blew her all the way across the 38th parallel and into North Korea, where she meets Captain Ri, a captain in the North Korean army. And they fall in love, and it's all about Seri's journey back to South Korea and all the enemies of Captain Ri and people who want to bring his family down. And basically it's about a love that's challenged by not just distance but by the 38 parallel itself, in that sense, is not just about the distance between, you know, this man and this woman, but also between South Korea and North Korea. You know, the political and historical separations that continue to keep apart people, families. And of course, this story resonates a lot with Koreans who, because of events in the 20th century, you know, they've been colonized by Japan, liberated by the US, but then their country came to be split in this very arbitrary parallel, 38 parallel. So if you watch that movie and you pay attention to, if you're the sort of discerning viewer who could appreciate the themes presented, it's a very good series because of, it will take hours and hours for me to properly do justice to the genius of that show in terms of you know, all, the way that it makes use of all of these elements, you know, character, dialogue, mise en scène, and symbolisms, and music, and suffice to say that if you're a viewer who appreciates all of that, and the whole message about separation and destiny, you know, it has a transformative effect, especially if you're Korean, or if you're not a Korean, but you begin to appreciate this the reality of separation and the human will to overcome that kind of separation. So it has a transformative effect. That's what we mean by mimesis 3. You don't just read a story or watch a K-drama, for example, and leave it behind and go back to your real life. It's not like that. In the first place, you come into the story with certain expectations from real life. And then you go through the story, or you watch the story, you live with the story, and then you come out afterward, having been transformed in some way, so that it has certain effects in your real life. And in that way, real life and stories interact in this progressive rather than vicious circle, you know. So that's essentially what Ricoeur means by the threefold mimesis. And I quite obviously spent so many minutes expounding on this because again, I think the ideas of these philosophers are not given much attention in philosophy of fiction, and he offers insights that stand to clarify issues when it comes to the nature of fiction. So if you consider this theory of narrative presented by Ricoeur, it shows us that narratives in general, whether they're fictional or non-fictional, have a transformative meaning-making effect. And this motivates, you know, Derek Matraver's argument that the distinction between fiction and non-fiction, at the end of the day, is not all that significant. What's significant is how we engage with fiction versus how we engage with the actual world. Not the distinction between fiction and non-fiction, in as much as the latter two are both narratives. Alright?